Hey guys, tonight we step softly into the polished halls of a royal morning. A time when even a king's day began not with trumpets, but with toast, warm slippers, and the slow turn of a silver spoon. We're not here to recount battles or debates. A faint glow from the fireplace flickers against the dark wood panels of the royal bedchamber. Coals gently smolder in their bed of ash, sending small pulses of heat into the cool morning air. The thick velvet curtains remain drawn, holding back the pale light of dawn. In this stillness, the first breath of day settles into the room like a soft exhale. Tonight, we drift into the stillness of a palace at dawn, where time itself seemed to slow, where meals mark the passage of hours like gentle bells in the fog. The room is filled with a kind of sacred quiet, not silence from emptiness, but the warm hush of a space gently preparing to come alive. The daily rhythm of King George III unfolds before us, not in grandeur, but in grace. A faint shift beneath the covers, a hand resting near the embroidered edge of the blanket. His first step of the day is into warmth slippers that have been pre-warmed, a robe that holds the night's quiet inside its folds. The tray is simple, but elegant. A single slice of toast, perfectly golden. Each second seems to stretch and settle into the walls. The act of the meal is more important than its completion, not with declarations or audiences, but with stillness and warmth. Footmen begin to light hallway sconces. The sun has risen, but remains hidden behind gentle clouds. From breakfast to supper, and every warm drink and thoughtful pause between, we'll move slowly as tea steeps, as slowly as slippers glide across stone. Yet none of this intrudes. Inside the morning room, the world remains wrapped in its cocoon of quiet. The routines of royalty, when observed without spectacle, reveal something deeply human, the need for comfort, for pause, for breath. Nourishment is not measured in fullness, but in presence. The king remains seated, eyes half closed, basking in the flicker of firelight and the softness of the rug beneath his feet. Just a king, his meals, and the quiet unfolding of a day in peaceful stillness. In a world where decisions can ripple across empires, here there is only the warmth of food and the stillness of morning. A curl of soft butter resting in a small dish. 2 poached eggs, yolks just set, and a teapot wrapped in a heavy cloth, keeping the brew hot but never scalding. He washes his face in the scented water, steam rising like morning fog. The warmth revives gently, without jarring the senses. This, too, is part of the rhythm. Light creeps around the edge of the curtains, illuminating the warm rug underfoot, the deep sheen of waxed oak furniture, the gentle glimmer of silver trays by the hearth. So settle in, and let's begin with the hush of a royal morning. A low-backed chair near the hearth provides a view of the windows, now filling slowly with light. There is no newspaper, no royal correspondence, no advisors waiting with urgent updates. The first hour of the day belongs to simplicity. The air holds the scent of toast and tea, mingled with beeswax and the last traces of nighttime firewood. The day begins not with sound, but with warmth. On a small side table near the fire, a copper basin steams quietly, filled with water scented lightly with rosemary and mint. The valet sets it down with practiced care, laying beside it a warmed flannel cloth and a fine bristled brush. Next to them, the king's dressing gown lies folded on a padded chair, its edges slightly warmed from being placed near the hearth. Everything is exactly as it should be, familiar, measured, comforting. In the far reaches of the estate, cooks whisper over warming pans and softly crack eggs into bowls. Butter is laid out to soften. Toast is sliced from a loaf baked the night before. Tea leaves are measured into a silver pot, waiting to be steeped in freshly drawn water. Each item has a place and a rhythm, nothing abrupt, nothing loud. The sound filters through the stone walls, softened by layers of drapery and velvet. There's no wind yet, only a hint of movement in the ivy brushing gently against the window panes. Beyond the glass, the sky shifts slowly from blue-gray to the muted gold of an overcast English dawn. This morning routine, repeated endlessly, becomes almost ceremonial. At the foot of the bed, a pair of soft leather slippers rests, positioned just so. Outside, faint birdsong begins to stir in the distant hedgerows. The first movement comes as the palace kitchen begins to wake. Back in the king's chamber, the bed remains undisturbed, its quilted blankets rising and falling with slow, steady breath. When the king begins to stir, it is not sudden. The king rises slowly, assisted only if needed. By now, the breakfast tray has arrived, carried on velvet-lined trolleys that make no sound on the stone floors. The king eats alone, not because of duty or solitude, but because the quiet hours are best preserved undisturbed. He eats slowly, a sip of tea between bites. The porcelain cup returns softly to its saucer. The butter spreads in delicate swirls across the bread. Across the room, a clock ticks gently, its sound muffled by layers of thick fabric and distance. Time moves differently here, unhurried, unpressed. As the meal ends, the tray is taken quietly away. Nothing clinks. The teapot is half full, the toast partly eaten. It doesn't matter. This room, this ritual, is where the day truly begins. Outside, the palace slowly comes to life. Horses stir in their stables. Tonight, we'll follow this rhythm meal by meal, hour by hour, as the day of King George III gently unfolds. So close your eyes, if you like. Let the rhythm carry you. There is nothing to remember, nothing to anticipate. The morning, now a little older, unfolded slowly through the thick velvet curtains of the royal chamber. Light filtered in with such delicacy that it didn't so much brighten the room as gently warm it. The glow was soft muted gold sliding across the floorboards, tracing the embroidery on the foot of the bed, and catching the glint of polished brass buttons on a folded waistcoat nearby. From its soft orange heart came heat that gently reached across the rug, over the edge of the bed, and into the surrounding air. Their interiors were lined with lamb's wool, warm just enough to cradle his step. The floor, though made of cold stone beneath centuries of wax and polish, never met his skin. It was part of the care of the household. Warmth first, always. Dust motes floated through the beams like tiny lanterns, suspended in the air. The curtains remained only slightly parted, enough to let the day in without flooding the serenity that the early morning preserved. The scent of faintly charred oak blended with the morning's herbal undertones lavender, mint. From the lower floors, the muffled sounds of breakfast preparation began. A clink of porcelain, the squeak of a wooden drawer, the faint rustle of aprons and petticoats moving through pantry halls. It was the background music to the king's morning, and a touch of rosemary left behind in the basin where the king had washed his face just moments before. The valet entered with the same grace that had carried him earlier. His limbs grew gradually lighter, his posture more upright. He did not rise for duty, but simply because the morning invited him to. In his hands, a basin emptied of water, a folded cloth now used and still faintly warm, and the anticipation of breakfast to come. He did not linger, only passed through, leaving in his wake a renewed sense of calm. It moved across the rug and curled gently up around the king's ankles. No wind rustled the leaves yet. The sky held the kind of peace that only comes just before the sun takes full ownership of the day. Stillness ruled, not silence. But now, in this small interval between rest and nourishment, there was only the quiet preparation of a royal morning measured, composed, and filled with softness. The room, with all its comfort, would wait for his return. For now, the next chapter of the day was waiting a meal simple in form but rich in warmth. Rather than disturb, it reminded one of change of time's movement even here in this timeless palace. The laces, looped into perfect bows, felt like punctuation to a paragraph long in the telling. When he finally stepped into them, The motion was like sealing the morning, marking the end of one quiet and the beginning of another. But that movement was soft, slow, a gentle nudge rather than a push. The king would soon move toward the east-facing room where the table had been set. Beneath it, the stone was cool, a reminder of the palace's age. Generations had passed through these rooms. Generations had followed the same rhythms, woken to the same quiet, eaten from the same tray, slept in the same hush. But first, he stood by the window for a moment, gazing through the sheer fabric that veiled the garden outside. The covers were smoothed, the pillows fluffed and rearranged, the heavy drapery drawn back just a little further. But for the king, now seated in a high-backed chair near the fire, the day was only beginning to unfurl its first petals. It was a scent that marked the turning of time, familiar, welcome, reassuring. King George III began his rise not with urgency, but with familiarity. Often he didn't read in the mornings, but the book served as a symbol of stillness. The stone walls, ancient and thick, held the night's chill at bay. Tapestries depicting pastoral scenes hung from them, their colors muted by time, their threads heavy with the hush of long years. Shrubs released their scent as they warmed under the pale sky. Birds chirped in the hedgerows, their calls bouncing off stone pathways and clipped hedges. All of this happened at a distance, a respectful space away from the king's quiet. Its pages, like the hours, could be turned slowly, if at all. There were no sudden motions, no calls for assistance, no fanfare of any kind. The first stretch of his arms, beneath the layers of quilted blankets, was deliberate and unhurried. His breath was steady. The room remained quiet. The fire, still flickering in the hearth, offered a comforting crackle that punctuated the hush. The slippers, placed perfectly beside the bed, awaited his feet like old companions. His clothing had been carefully laid out across a cushioned bench. Linen shirt, pressed trousers, and a vest of soft wool. Each piece was warm from the fire and smelled faintly of starch and cedar. There was something soothing in the routine, in the exactness of where every fold rested, where every seam aligned. A valet, never in view, had ensured that everything was ready. The dressing-gown, hung beside the hearth overnight, now held a gentle, stored warmth like sunshine caught in fabric. The king slid it over his shoulders without a sound, his movements quiet and practiced. Dressing for the king was not rushed. The sunlight, growing bolder by the moment, moved up the far wall of the room. Elsewhere in the palace, servants moved with care. Distant footsteps echoed down long corridors, barely more than a hum. The bed, now vacated, was quickly refreshed by unseen hands. A small table beside him held a book bound in soft leather, well thumbed and worn. Though the text was familiar, there was comfort in its presence. The room remained cool enough for the fire to feel necessary, but warm enough to be restful. A faint draught stirred from under the door, not cold but simply noticeable. Beyond the walls of the chamber, the gardens began to breathe. Trees shook off the last drops of dew. When the door to the room opened, it did so without sound. Time moved forward, but barely. There was no need to check the hour, for the king's body followed a rhythm older than clocks. His shoes, placed near the dressing bench, were polished and supple. Breakfast was not yet served, but it was close. The grounds, with their clipped hedges and winding paths, were bathed in soft light. The king breathed deeply. The air held a hint of ash, toast, and cool moisture like parchment and morning fog. His hand rested lightly on the sill. Soon the day would gently grow. There would be tea, perhaps a walk, books and candles, more meals and more pauses. The king turned away from the window and made his way toward the door, his footsteps soundless on the rug. The breakfast room waited in hushed anticipation. Its windows faced east, welcoming the soft light of morning as it pooled gently on the stone floor. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, spilling over polished tabletops and gilded moldings with the gentlest touch, like warm water poured from a silver pot, and a mantle that still held the faint scent of last night's ashes. Here, King George took his morning meal not in grandeur, but in stillness. It was a room designed for quietude, where only the sounds of porcelain and silver marked the hours. The space was modest by palace standards, just a small room off the long corridor, adorned with cream-colored walls, low wainscoting. On the table before him, the breakfast tray was already set. The silver was polished to a warm gleam, not a harsh shine, and the fire within the small hearth offered an occasional crackle. Time didn't pass in minutes here. It did not interrupt the room. It accompanied it, like the quiet hum of bees in a distant hedge. The sound reminded the king not of passing time, but of presence, of being exactly where one should be, without need for motion or urgency. It moved in softness, in the way the tea cooled slowly in its cup, in the gradual way sunlight climbed up the legs of a wooden chair. The plates bore no elaborate crest, only a subtle ivory border. He gazed quietly at the soft folds of the curtain, and the way light danced along the handle of the teacup. The milk was added not from a pitcher, but from a delicate jug of warmed cream, poured in a slow swirl that clouded the amber liquid before settling into gold. The door remained closed, the brass handle cool and still. The cooling of the tea, the final bite of toast. The king did not announce when he was finished. He simply sat, allowing the moment to close itself. He folded the napkin with a practiced hand and placed it gently beside the plate. All noise was distant, muffled by walls, and softened by purpose. This room had only one task, to ease the king into the day, but not yet, not now. For a few more minutes, the room remained suspended in its stillness. The fire glowed, the sun continued its slow reach across the window glass, and the scent of morning clung to the air like soft wool. He lifted the cup with both hands, not out of necessity, but because there was no need to rush. Only about the warmth of the cup in his hands, the golden tones of morning, and the comfort of having started another day, not in haste, but in stillness. The air was faintly sweet, as if the warmth of the tea and the buttered toast had merged with the old wood of the table and the worn books on the far shelf. The warmth of the porcelain pressed gently into his palms. Its crust, still crisp, cracked slightly as he broke off another piece. He savored each bite, not because it was luxurious, but because it was familiar. A moment of texture and temperature, of softness and crunch, of memory and morning combined. Everything in this space, the scent of toast, the mellow tone of the drapes, the rhythm of the light seemed chosen not to impress, but to comfort. Breakfast was simple. A pair of soft-boiled eggs, their shells nestled in tiny cups lined with white cloth. The king did not eat much. He never had. But the offering itself was part of the ritual and act of care, of presentation, of the comforting predictability that came from eating the same simple foods, day after day, in the same comforting space. That would come later in another room. This hour was preserved for peace. The table had been cleared of clutter, save for a white napkin, a folded paper serviette, and a small vase holding a single bloom of pale blue cornflower, plucked perhaps from the garden beyond the hedge. The grass was heavy with dew. The gravel paths had not yet been disturbed by footsteps. Sparrows chirped near the hedgerows. A single cloud drifted like a thought across the pale sky, carrying no message, only motion. Toast, lightly golden, cut into quarters and arranged with gentle symmetry. The butter, freshly churned and pale as cream, sat in a porcelain dish with a small knife laid precisely beside it. He spread butter on a piece of toast, the knife moving slowly, creating soft ridges in the melted surface. He took a bite, chewed without hurry, and looked toward the window. Nothing was rushed. Nothing out of place. Steam rose from a silver teapot wrapped in a thick woolen cozy. It smelled of black tea rich, earthy, with a hint of dried leaves and quiet rain. The pot had steeped just long enough to deepen the flavor without drawing bitterness. It waited patiently to be poured, as if it, too, understood the unhurried nature of the day. The king sat with a posture that was neither stiff nor slouched. He moved with economy-measured gestures, practiced motions. Outside, the garden yawned beneath a blanket of early morning mist. The room around him breathed. Not literally, but in the way the walls held echoes. The curtains swayed just slightly. The king's spoon clinked gently as it stirred the tea, silver against porcelain. On the far wall, a grandfather clock ticked away the seconds. A small basket of fruit stood at the edge of the table, slices of pear, a fig cut into quarters, 2 grapes resting side by side like old friends. The toast, now half eaten, gave off a faint aroma of warm bread and butter. There were no documents beside his plate, no letters from the ministers, no reports from the colonies. The king paused between bites, not from fatigue, but simply to allow space between each motion, between each sip, between each thought. Somewhere in the corridor, a footman passed on quiet soles. His movement was ghost-like, trained not to disturb. A bee bumped against the window pane once, then wandered off. Dust danced in the light like flecks of memory. A bell did not ring to mark the end of the meal. There was no signal, only the gradual emptying of the plate. The tray would be removed soon. Someone would come and refill the teapot, remove the crumbs, straighten the chair. The king looked once more toward the window. He wasn't thinking about the tasks ahead. And so breakfast came to a close, not with noise or finality, but with the gentle settling of light into shadow. The room exhaled. The king stood slowly. Beyond the breakfast room, through a side door framed in ivy, lay the king's garden path, winding trail of stone and moss that threaded quietly through the royal grounds. It wasn't a grand promenade, not one meant for display or ceremony. It was intimate, slightly hidden, a place known only to those who valued stillness above spectacle. Here and there, the leaves had grown a bit wild, an intentional imperfection left by the gardeners, who understood that nature should always be allowed a touch of freedom. The scent of rosemary rose from the edges, mingling with lavender and a hint of damp earth still cool from the night. The air outside was cool, but not sharp. It held the lingering warmth of sunrise. Softened by the rustle of leaves, the hem of his coat swayed just slightly, catching the morning air as he passed beneath a wooden arbor draped in climbing ivy. To let his eyes rest on the quiet movement of branches, or to note the pattern of shadow on a wall. These moments were never wasted. They were a part of the walk itself, like commas in a sentence meant to be read slowly. Drops of dew lingered on the leaves, catching the sunlight and holding it like small stars trapped in green. The shadows danced slowly over the path, painting it in soft golds and silvers. Nothing moved quickly. Even the birds seemed to fly slower here, dipping in long, lazy arcs from treetop to treetop. And when he stopped to stand beneath a lilac tree, the quiet became so complete that it seemed the entire world was breathing in time with him. A bee hummed in the distance. Leaves rustled faintly. Somewhere, water trickled from a stone fountain, hidden from view but gently present in sound. The cool shade of the trees wrapped around him, and for a moment he stood still, letting the quiet press gently against his shoulders like a soft cloak. There was no need to move quickly. The garden would always wait. This was what the walk was for, not exercise or appearances, but presence. A daily ritual that asked nothing more than stillness and attention. The air around them was sweet but subtle, a fragrance that whispered rather than shouted. From here, he could see the distant line of the palace rooftops, their chimneys rising against the soft sky. But even this view did not hurry him. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, taking in the full quiet of the space. Its markings were still clear, but the king did not check the time. He had no need to know the hour. The walk itself was enough a kind of slow unfolding that measured the day not in minutes, but in moments of noticing. Bees moved from petal to petal, their wings vibrating in a hum that merged seamlessly with the sounds of morning, and the gentle kiss of a breeze that drifted through the hedges like a whispered invitation. The king sat, not to rest, but to feel the coolness of the stone against the back of his legs. The garden seemed to sigh as the day stretched onward. The king turned, retracing his steps slowly, the stones now familiar beneath his feet. The scent of herbs and the warmth of the sun followed him as he made his way back along the winding path. The bench had been there for many years. Its edges were softened with time, its surface worn smooth by countless quiet mornings like this one. Their branches stretched overhead, forming a kind of leafy archway. Sunlight filtered through in soft beams, illuminating floating dust particles and casting dappled light onto the stones below. It was a place that seemed to exist outside of time. Its fragrance reached the king's senses like a memory warm, earthy, and familiar. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the scent wrap around him like a thread connecting this moment to countless others, all quiet, all peaceful. The king stepped outside slowly, the soles of his shoes brushing against gravel with a muted rhythm that matched the easy pace of his breath. The path was bordered by low hedgerows, their tops neatly trimmed but not rigidly so. A robin darted from bush to branch. The sound of its wings flitting through the morning air made no more noise than a turning page. Above, the sky was soft and open. The clouds stretched thin like threads of wool, pulled gently across the horizon. There was no urgency to the day, only the measured unfolding of time, one step at a time, along the winding path. Each corner of the trail revealed something new, yet entirely familiar. A stone bench, its surface dappled in shadow. A bed of sage, silver in the light. Tiny violets blooming beneath a rosebush, their petals barely stirring as the breeze passed overhead. Everything had its place, and everything belonged. The king moved slowly, his hands behind his back, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He paused now and then, not because he was tired, but because it was his habit to observe. The sound of his footsteps was soft, barely more than a hush against the stones. At the corner of the path stood a small alcove open curve in the hedge that cradled a weathered bench. He leaned back slightly, his gaze following the branches above, where the sunlight filtered through in shifting patterns. On the other side of the path, a patch of thyme spread low against the ground. Further along, a small rose garden waited. The blooms were not yet fully open, just beginning to unfurl in pale pinks and creams. The path bent slightly at this point, leading to a small grove of linden trees. The king passed through slowly, each step matching the rhythm of his breath. Near the edge of the path stood a sundial, worn smooth by decades of sun and weather. A butterfly landed on the sundial's base, its wings opening and closing in rhythmic calm. The king watched it, unmoving. As he neared the end of the path, the garden opened into a wider clearing. Birdsong rose gently from the hedges, interwoven with the breeze. As he reached the arched door once more, the king paused his hand, resting for a moment on the ivy-covered frame. He looked once more toward the lilacs, the linden trees, the small rose garden with its unopened blooms. There was no ceremony at the threshold, no trumpet or bell. The corridors held the faintest echo of past footsteps, like memories that had settled into the stone walls and whispered gently as he passed. Light streamed in through tall windows, filtered through sheer linen, casting long rectangles across the floors that looked like soft sheets waiting to be turned down. Just a slow push of the wooden door, and the gentle sigh of hinges polished smooth by time. It was not loud but clear, and the kind of sound that seemed to melt into the air rather than break it. He reached first for the teacup, lifting it with both hands, as though warming his fingers before tasting the drink itself. It was the sort of drink that softened the edges of thought, clearing the mind, not with sharpness, but with stillness. The king sipped slowly, letting the warmth rest in his chest before swallowing. His breath moved gently through his nose, like the turning of a quiet page. The hour required no announcement. It merely drifted in, as natural as sunlight falling across a page. The binding was loose, the leather warm to the touch. He opened it not to a specific chapter, but to wherever it had last been left. A shadow changed shape, but the room remained the same, warm, settled, held in the gentle balance between wakefulness and rest. They paired gently with the tea, the flavors overlapping like the folds of a well-worn blanket. Nothing interrupted. Everything blended. There was no sensation of fullness, no sense of appetite being conquered. He held the last sip of tea in his hands for a long while, letting its warmth rest against his fingers before bringing it once more to his lips. It was a ritual not of sustenance, but of comfort, a space carved gently into the day where nothing was asked and nothing needed to be accomplished. The food was merely part of the moment, like the light or the silence or the soft weight of the book resting across his lap. The pages offered no urgency. They simply lay open, ready to be seen or passed over as the mood allowed. Within the palace, the air held a different softness, the warmth of interior stone, the distant hush of activity far away in other wings of the estate. The kind of reading he did in the mid-morning was less about learning and more about drifting. Words were less important than rhythm. Sentences became rivers, flowing gently through his thoughts, smoothing rough edges and carrying him forward with no destination in mind. Each sound a swallow, a rustle of cloth, a faint creak from the chair felt like a punctuation mark in a sentence too old to finish. There was no conversation, no servant standing nearby. Only presence. The honey, drizzled with care, clung to the silver spoon like sunlight on glass. It shimmered but did not rush. The king dipped his biscuit slowly, letting the honey pool and glisten before he brought it to his lips. There was no abundance, no extravagance. Just a small plate of crisp biscuits, arranged with quiet symmetry, and a delicate dish of honey beside them. A few slices of pear, pale and translucent, glistened slightly in the light. Some had been read again and again, their pages softened by years of turning. Others had never been opened, and never would be. But they remained, like patient companions, contents simply to be near. A thin curl of steam rose from a nearby teacup, its handle turned toward the king, as if inviting him to pause and stay a while. Then he stepped inside, carrying the stillness of the garden with him like a memory pressed between pages. The quiet of the garden still clung to the king's coat as he returned inside. The king made his way to the library, his steps slow and soundless over thick carpets woven with faded floral patterns. By the time he arrived at his usual chair, a high-backed piece set beside the window, the clock chimed a low, rounded note. Upon a side table lay a silver tray, simple and elegant. The king did not sit immediately. He stood at the window first, looking out across the back gardens where the stone path he had just walked now shimmered faintly with light. A bird dipped low over the hedgerows, its flight slow and fluid. The trees swayed gently, not from any wind, but from the invisible motion of the day unfolding without rush. When he finally sat, it was with the kind of ease that comes only from routine, the kind that has worn itself into the fabric of a day so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from breathing. The tea had changed from breakfast now, a lighter blend, infused with chamomile and a whisper of lemon balm. The biscuits were crisp, their edges just browned. Each bite gave a soft snap, followed by a slow melting of sweetness. Time, in this room, moved in fractions. Each movement was unhurried. Books lined the shelves in quiet rows, their spines cracked with use, their titles faded to near invisibility. The king reached for one now, chosen not for purpose but for familiarity. He read for a while, though not for long. Outside, the light shifted slightly. A branch moved. The pear slices, soft and cool, left the faintest sweetness on the tongue. From the hallway came the subtle sound of distant footsteps, cushioned by carpet. They approached and then faded. A door creaked softly. A curtain fluttered. The mid-morning meal was not a grand affair, but it was never skipped. And so the king sat, as he always did, watching the light rise slowly across the spines of old books and the silver gleam of an empty plate. He would not finish the chapter. He would not finish the pear. That was never the point. Beneath the palace, beyond the grand dining chambers, and tucked behind a curved stone archway, lay the royal kitchen. Unlike the bustling kitchens of grand banquets or festive celebrations, this particular corner of the palace moved with a different kind of rhythm, a quieter one. It was a place not of urgency, but of practice. As the light shifted, it caught their outlines, drawing long shadows that danced ever so faintly on the worn flagstones below. The kitchen, though often filled with activity, held an atmosphere of hush, like a room that had learned to speak softly no matter how many people passed through it. Nearby, another prepared leeks, trimming their long green tops and washing the pale stalks in a wide ceramic basin. Its flames were not fierce, but controlled, offering a steady heat that warmed the tiled walls. Slices of crusty bread waited in a linen-lined basket beside small crocks of soft butter. Potatoes had been roasted in their skins, their golden insides barely visible beneath the folds. Everything was prepared with precision, but none of it felt fussy or extravagant. The sound, while subtle, added to the sense that the kitchen itself was always in motion, but never rushed. It breathed in small moments preparations made, heat slowly rising, flavors building with the passing of each hour. It passed over the tops of the counters, lifting the corners of a folded cloth and causing a tiny brass ladle to rock in its place. It had been filled with water from the pump in the courtyard and left to heat over coals that hissed softly beneath it. The lid clicked now and then, but did not rattle. Its steam would soon join the others, weaving a new strand into the tapestry of scent that hung invisibly in the air. The air brought no urgency, only a subtle reminder of the world beyond the kitchen walls. The food was not meant to impress, but to soothe. Not an empty silence, but a full one rich with scent, warmth, and the gentle hum of quiet preparation. Above it, a pot simmered slowly, releasing gentle swirls of steam that carried with them the scent of rosemary and parsnip. Each person understood the pace. Each hand moved with care. The last of the chopping done, the last of the herbs tucked away. The fire glowed low. The windows brightened slightly with the rising of the sun. The spoons, set on white cloth napkins, were polished but plain functional without fanfare. The food was not merely prepared. It was coaxed gently into being. It simply waited, ready, quiet. Wooden spoons rested in ceramic jars. Knives were sharpened and then laid carefully on folded cloth. Their surfaces were polished, but not gleaming, reflecting the room in softened tones rather than sharp detail. Above them, shelves held jars of preserves, their contents dark and rich, each sealed and labeled in a careful hand. A row of apples sat nearby, their skins dull from the coolness of the stone, their presence more ornamental than necessary. There was a reverence in the way the kitchen was arranged, not from ceremony, but from repetition. Every action had been performed 1,000 times before, and in that repetition there was comfort. The aroma was not overpowering, but warm and familiar, an edible memory that seemed to linger in the air long after the pot had cooled. Water lapped gently against the sides of the bowl with each movement, its sound so soft it barely rose above the quiet hum of the room. And patience, where meals were prepared as part of the day's gentle unfolding, not as a spectacle of service. The floors were laid in broad stone tiles, each one slightly uneven from years of footfall. Their cool surfaces bore the quiet history of steps taken slowly of careful movements across the same familiar routes. Morning light filtered down through narrow windows, casting rectangular shapes across the floor, broken only by the gentle sway of dried herbs hanging above. No one rushed to meet it. The hour would come when it wished. The meal would be ready not when the bell insisted, but when the aroma deepened and the broth darkened just so. Bundles of thyme, lavender, and bay hung in careful clusters from wooden beams, their edges curled with age, their scent infused into the very air. A large wooden table stood at the center, its surface scarred from years of chopping, kneading, and gentle preparation. Around it moved the kitchen staff, not hurried or loud, but coordinated in quiet understanding. The clink of ceramic bowls, the low rustle of linen aprons, and the rhythmic sound of a blade slicing gently through root vegetables were the only music the kitchen needed. In one corner, a cook peeled carrots with smooth, practiced strokes, the shavings curling onto a linen cloth like paper ribbons. At the hearth, a low fire crackled beneath an iron stove. On a side table, small dishes were arranged in quiet rows. Each utensil was placed gently into its place. Ladles hung neatly on hooks. The light from the hearth flickered across copper pans that hung from the walls. One could hear the soft whisk of a broom brushing across the far corner of the room, gathering the day's flour dust and crumbs into a neat pile. A brass clock on the far wall ticked gently, its pendulum swinging with a rhythm that matched the slow pulse of the kitchen. A small window near the ceiling opened slightly, letting in a drift of air that smelled of moss and stone and garden soil. At the edge of the room, resting on a small stool by the fireplace, sat a kettle warming slowly. This was how the royal kitchen worked, not with commands or calls, but with gestures and timing and quiet knowing. Even the wooden bowls into which the food would be placed had been warmed slightly beside the hearth, so that when the first spoonful of soup touched the surface, it met a kindred warmth. And when everything was finally arranged, when the roasted vegetables were plated, and the bread nestled softly in the basket, and the soup reached that exact consistency where its surface barely quivered, the meal was not called. The king would not eat yet. Luncheon would come soon, in its time. For now, the kitchen returned to stillness, and the room, filled only moments ago with motion, settled again into silence. The morning had slipped by like soft mist over the lawns, and now the palace entered its quiet midday rhythm. Luncheon was not far, though it would not arrive with noise or summons. It would come gently, as it always did, preceded by the delicate. Rituals that made the meal feel as much a part of the day as the changing of the light dot in the dining salon. A room reserved for the king's more intimate midday meals, the table stood ready to be dressed. It was oval in shape, carved from dark walnut and polished until it held a dull glow, not a shine. The grain of the wood swirled like smoke beneath a varnish softened by time. A tall window let in filtered light through gauzy curtains, casting. The table in a soft, silvery tone. 2 footmen entered without speaking, their movements practiced and calm. They unfolded the tablecloth, a square of pale cream linen, and let it fall gently over the surface. Its edges draped like fabric over still water, settling without a wrinkle. A flick of the wrist smoothed it into place. There was no rush dot then. Came the place settings, retrieved from a wooden cabinet that creaked quietly as it opened. Each plate, rimmed with a faded gold line, was handled with care. Silverware followed, each piece placed with gentle precision. A fork laid parallel too. A knife, a soup spoon set slightly askew, as if in conversation with its neighbors. The napkin, pressed into a soft square, was folded atop the plate like a silent invitation dot in the center of the table. A low arrangement of late summer blooms had already been placed earlier that morning. Pale roses, sprigs of rosemary, and small bunches of dried lavender created a cluster of scent and color that blended gently with the room's natural stillness. They weren't meant to draw attention only to a company. like the soft scent of candle wax in a quiet church. The air in the room was neither cool nor warm, but steady. It smelled of polished wood, dried flowers, and the distant trace of roasted root vegetables wafting from the kitchen. The kind of air that invited slow breathing and long pauses between movements. As the final fork was adjusted by a careful hand, the room felt full, though no one spoke, and no one ate. This, too, was a form of nourishment, preparation made gently, for a meal that was more about pause than indulgence. Beyond the dining room, through the stone passageway that led toward the kitchen, the final touches of luncheon continued in silence. The cooks had already plated the chicken roasted to a delicate gold, resting in a shallow pool of its own juices. Next to it sat a small dish of mashed potatoes, whipped slowly with butter and cream, and sprinkled with freshly ground pepper. Vegetables had been steamed and arranged in simple rose carrots, pale green peas, and thin ribbons of cabbage that shimmered slightly under a faint glaze of oil. Everything about the meal was light, balanced, and quiet. In one corner of the kitchen, a small bowl of herbs was prepared to be brought to the table. Parsley and mint, mostly, their leaves curled gently at the edges, as if in rest. A final tasting was done, not with urgency, but with attentive care. A spoon dipped, then paused in the air, then returned to its resting place on a cloth beside the stove. In the corridor outside, the butler moved with a kind of slowness that came from years of repetition. He held the carved wooden menu board, not to present with pomp, but simply to note the contents of the midday meal in tidy cursive. The board would stand quietly by the side table in the dining room, not for show, but for continuity. Back in the salon, the light from the tall windows shifted slightly, warming the table and bathing the silverware in a soft gleam. Dust motes danced lazily in the beam, rising and falling in slow spirals, untouched and unnoticed. The chairs, upholstered in velvet the color of deep wine, waited in perfect stillness. The chair at the head of the table, the king's own, bore the slightest indentation in its cushion, a sign of familiarity, of daily use. A nearby sideboard held a silver pitcher of water, beads of condensation forming slowly along its sides. A small glass bowl of lemon slices sat nearby, its contents catching the light and bending it through pale yellow arcs across the surface. Nothing was hurried. The entire room seemed to exhale as one, as if preparing itself for the hour to arrive not on schedule, but in harmony. One of the windows creaked open just slightly, letting in a thread of air. It carried with it the distant sound of a carriage, wheel on gravel, muffled and rhythmic, and the faint coo of a pigeon nesting in the eaves. The breeze moved through the curtains like a sigh, disturbing nothing, and then slipped away again. Outside, the sun hung just past its highest point. The shadows on the palace lawn shortened, softening at the edges. The garden beyond shimmered, with the gentle heat of midday, and the scent of warm stone drifted through the lower hallways. Inside, the dining room grew a touch brighter, as if in anticipation. Everything was in place. The plates were warmed. The crystal water glasses gleamed. Even the cushions in the chairs had settled, as though sighing in preparation for stillness. There was nothing more to be done. The kitchen fell silent again, save for the gentle knock of a pot being set back on the iron rack and the rustle of aprons being brushed clean. In the dining salon, the only sound was the soft whisper of time moving forward, unbothered and unhurried. Soon, the king would arrive not to feast, but to sit slowly and eat in the way he did all things, with presence, with rhythm, and with the quiet dignity of someone who knew that each meal was just another verse in the soft poem of the day. The clock somewhere in the distant corridor gave a muted chime once, then once more. The sound rang low, as though cushioned by velvet, marking the approach of midday without calling attention to itself. In the dining salon, where every detail, had been quietly arranged, a new kind of stillness took hold. The kind that comes just before something begins. Sunlight spilled in from the high windows, warming the polished surface of the table. It caught on the curve of a spoon, glinted softly off the gold rim of a plate, and diffused through the linen curtains in pale streaks. The air had that settled kind of warmth, neither heavy nor bright, but full in content. Outside, the garden shimmered with gentle light, though from within the palace walls, only a vague impression of leaves shifting could be felt. The king entered the room without fanfare. There was no sound of footsteps announced, no rustle of robes to fill the space. Instead, his presence joined the room like a breeze, moving in and becoming part of it without disruption. He approached the table, his chair already drawn out slightly, inviting him to settle in with ease. The cushion gave way beneath him as he sat, the velvet compressing with the softest sound. A table, already prepared with thought and care, seemed to welcome him with a kind of quiet intimacy. The bowl of soup was placed before him, cream of parsnip, gently garnished with sprigs of rosemary. Steam rose in delicate spirals, curling into the shafts of sunlight like pale ribbons. He took up the spoon, not with haste, but with familiar grace. Each movement was measured, not out of stiffness, but because there was no need for speed. This was not a moment to pass through. It was one to inhabit fully. The spoon met the soup, and then his lips, and then returned again slowly, quietly. Rhythmically dotted his right sat a small plate of fresh-baked bread, the crust still warm, its edge cracked with gentle fissures from the oven's embrace. A pat of butter, soft but not melting, rested beside it, and with a steady hand, the king spread a modest amount across the surface. The bread gave way with a faint, airy crunch as he broke a piece and lifted it to his mouth. The rest of the meal unfolded in much the same way. A slice of roasted chicken, perfectly tender, was eaten with soft appreciation. Mashed potatoes folded, with cream and a touch of white pepper, added warmth and fullness. Steamed green beans, lightly salted, offered contrast without sharpness. The entire experience was a layering of sensations, nothing bold, nothing demanding, simply present. Dining room, for all its silence, felt full of light, of warmth, of quiet satisfaction. The walls did not echo. They held the sound gently and let it fade as though tucking it away for safekeeping. The air was rich with aroma, but never overwhelming. Everything existed in perfect balance, suspended like a painting of time itself. At intervals, the king paused, not because he was tired or distracted, but because this was a meal to be felt. The pauses allowed the room to breathe. They allowed the warmth of the food to mingle with the warmth of the air, the softness of the chair to settle more deeply beneath him. During one of these pauses, his gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the world moved in the same quiet rhythm. A single butterfly traced a slow arc near the pane, its wings catching the light before it vanished again behind the gauzy curtain. The garden beyond waved gently in the breeze, the bushes swaying almost imperceptibly in the golden sun. It was the kind of moment that felt as if it had always existed, still, perfect, untouchable. Back at the table, a small glass of cool water stood waiting. He reached for it slowly, fingers closing around the stem, lifting it as though lifting a thought. The glass touched his lips, and the water, chilled and clear, offered its own kind of quiet refreshment. Even the sound it made, when set down again, was light, like a whisper in an empty corridor. As the meal continued, time seemed to stretch, not in the way of delay or boredom, but in the way a soft piece of music lingers just before the final note. Every detail, the feel of the tablecloth under his hand, the faint scent of lavender from the centerpiece, the low hum of the world beyond the window, contributed to a sense of immersion. There was no conversation, no noise, no interruption. The meal did not require them. It was enough simply to eat, to notice, to let the experience move through him like sunlight through a leaf. Even the final bites were not marked by finality. They were simply the next natural step, followed by a soft placing of the fork and knife onto the plate, a gentle folding of the napkin. He leaned back slightly, letting the fullness of the meal settle around him. Not the fullness of overindulgence, but the kind that comes when something has been done properly, completely, and with care. His hands rested loosely in his lap. His eyes did not close, but they did not seek anything new. They simply watched the light flicker through the curtains weave and let it happen. From another room, the sound of a clock gave one soft chime. It came not as a signal to move on, but as a kind companion gently suggesting the day was ready. To continue if one was ready too. The king remained seated a while longer. He did not rise quickly. The chair beneath him still held warmth. The table, cleared now of food but not of presence, seemed to hum softly with the quiet of contentment. There was no need to rush away. In fact, rushing would have undone the very peace the meal had built. Eventually, and only when the time felt right, he stood. The air shifted slightly with him, the sunlight catching now on the back of the chair as it eased back into place. A few steps carried him away from the table and toward the sunlit corridor beyond. The dining room was left just as it had been, quiet, warm, touched by light. Plates removed with care, linens smoothed once more, and the final traces of the midday meal returned to the peaceful rhythm of the day. The palace, for its part, carried on in hushed reverence. The halls, the rooms, the gardens all held their breath a little longer, as if the memory of lunch deserved its own space to linger. The midday meal had faded gently into memory, leaving behind only the soft satisfaction of a nourished body and an untroubled mind. The king rose slowly from his chair, not because he was required elsewhere, but because it felt like the natural progression of the hour, like the sun shifting slightly overhead, or the wind changing direction with no rush or announcement. He stepped out from the dining salon into the main corridor of the palace, where the air was still and faintly warm. The wooden floor beneath his feet was polished to a subtle sheen, the grain of the oak revealing swirls and knots worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. As he walked, his steps made the gentlest sound, an almost imperceptible creak of leather against wood, like a whisper echoing in a library. The corridor was long and gracious, lined on either side with high windows draped in velvet and lace. Pale sunlight filtered through in soft, steady bands, striping the floor in patches of gold and shadow. Occasionally, the curtains stirred slightly, though no wind was felt. The movement was like a sigh, a quiet breath from the walls themselves. Paintings hung along the corridor at regular intervals, their frames aged but elegant, the gilding dulled by time rather than neglect. Portraits of long-past nobles looked out with serene expressions, not judging, not watching, simply existing, like memories given form. Between each painting, small tables stood with simple arrangements: a bowl of dried lavender, a vase with wilting lily, a candle stub melted into a dish of brass. Nothing extravagant, yet everything precisely placed. The king walked without purpose beyond presence. Each step felt measured, not for precision, but for peace. There was no destination, only the corridor itself, a ribbon of quiet held in place by stone and time. His hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture easy, but upright. He breathed in slowly, and the scent of beeswax polish and old books filled his chest with comfort. On the left, a window opened slightly inward, its latch no longer firm, allowing a narrow shaft of fresher air to slip inside. It carried with it the green scent of hedges and the dry aroma of gravel paths warmed by the midday sun. Somewhere beyond the glass, a bird chirped once and then fell silent again, as if reminding the moment of its own completeness. The corridor bent gently ahead, guiding the king into a slightly narrower stretch. Here, the walls were closer, lined with wooden paneling that gave the space a deeper tone. Light fell more gently here, diffused and warm, creating shadows that flickered across the patterned carpet beneath his feet. The rhythm of his walk remained unchanged, slow, calm, without interruption. A grandfather clock stood at the bend, its casing dark and tall, the brass pendulum hidden behind a foggy pane of glass. The hands moved steadily, but not noticeably. It did not chime, it was not yet. The hour. The king glanced toward it, but continued past without pause, as if he and the clock had already spoken their quiet greeting many times before Dot in a recessed alcove. A cushioned bench invited rest. Its tapestry seat was faded but intact, depicting a hunting scene now soft with age, the colors blurred like a dream half remembered. The king did not sit, but passed slowly, letting his fingers brush the curve of its wooden armrest in passing, grounding himself for a brief moment in the material world. Dot further along. A narrow table held a glass decanter filled with water, untouched, beside a single tumbler. A tray of pale linen coasters sat beneath, corners lifted slightly from repeated use. A single white rose stood upright in a thin vase, its petals beginning to curl at the edges. All of it felt as if it had been placed there not for use, but for continuity, another stitch in the fabric of the day. Dot, as he reached the end of the corridor, the king paused. Ahead lay the west wing, quieter still, bathed in a thicker kind of stillness reserved for the early afternoon. But he did not move beyond the boundary. Instead, he turned slowly, his footfalls barely audible as he retraced his path. The return walk felt no different in pace, but the light had shifted ever so slightly. The gold that had streamed in from the high windows was now softer, brushed with ivory. Dust motes floated in the air like suspended time, catching the light and spinning lazily before drifting out of view. Passing once more beneath the gaze of the old portraits, he let his eyes linger briefly on the face of one noble woman, her expression unreadable, her painted eyes almost closed, as if she too were resting behind glass. Her hair was drawn up with pearls, and her hands rested lightly on a closed book. She had always been there, yet each pass made her seem slightly different, slightly quieter. The corridor offered no surprises, and that was its comfort. It promised sameness, stillness, the blessing of uneventful passage. The king walked as though time had folded in on itself, the way the tide folds over the sand again and again. He was not searching for anything. He was simply existing within the moment, as one exists within a lullaby. The sound of his own breathing became part of the corridor's voice. The rise and fall of his chest mirrored the shadows on the walls, rising and falling as the sun moved gently across the sky. The warmth from the window panes met his hands as he passed, like soft fabric brushing his skin. It grounded him. It hushed him. He approached the same window with the loose latch. It had not moved, but the light that filtered through it had changed, now tinged faintly with the golden tone of early afternoon. Outside, the same bird perched nearby. It gave no call this time, just the stillness of presence, of shared quiet. He reached the place where the corridor began. He paused again. The floor beneath him was familiar, the air unchanged. He had walked not to arrive, but to continue. The corridor was a part of the day's breath, and now it had exhaled. The corridor faded behind the king like a passage into stillness, each step leading him toward a gentler hour. The palace seemed to breathe with him now, its walls sighing in subtle creaks and soft warmth. There was a hush in the air that wasn't silence, but rather the sound of everything at rest. No bells rang, no voices rose. The day had folded into its quietest corner, He turned into a smaller sitting room, tucked between the main hall and the west wing. It was a chamber reserved for solitary hours, for moments when time itself needed to slow to a whisper. The door clicked softly behind him, barely a sound at all. As he entered the room and felt its familiar embrace, the hearth had already been prepared. Logs stacked neatly in the grate glowed with a gentle flame, sending flickers of amber along the polished floorboards. The fire was neither loud nor fierce. It danced with a quiet patience, content to warm rather than blaze. It gave off a scent of cedar and ash clean, faintly sweet. Like an old memory returning without warning. In the center of the room stood a high-backed armchair, its velvet worn smooth by years of use. The cushion sagged slightly in the middle, molded to the shape of a man who had sat there many afternoons before. A small footstool rested just in front, draped with a knitted shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Nearby, a side table held a half-finished book, its cloth cover faded, a ribbon tucked between the pages like a soft exhale, left unfinished. The king lowered himself into the chair slowly, not out of weakness, but in honor of the ritual. This chair was not simply for sitting, it was for surrendering, for letting go of the weight even a quiet day could carry. He let his arms fall gently to the rests, his shoulders uncoil, his thoughts dissolve. The room darkened slightly as a passing cloud shaded the windows. Shadows shifted gently across the rug, and the fire took on a deeper hue. The king's eyes followed the movement of flame for a while, watching as the logs cracked gently, occasionally letting out a slow pop, like a yawn. Sparks drifted upward inside the chimney, vanishing before they reached the top. The book on the table called to him not as a task, but as a companion. He picked it up with one hand and opened it to the marked page. The words were soft on the paper, the print small and steady. He read, not to learn, not to finish, but simply to drift with the language like floating downstream on a raft of vowels and punctuation. Every so often, his eyes paused. They rested on a word or a phrase or nothing at all. The meaning became misty, the lines blurring with the warmth in the room. The scent of the fire mixed with the light fragrance of the shawl and the feeling of his slippers, still warm from the corridor walk, grounded him in the moment. Somewhere far off, a bell gave a single chime, not a command, not a signal, just a whisper of time's presence. The king did not move. The book in his hand drooped slightly, its spine relaxed, and his fingers softened their grip. The weight of the day settled over him like the slow descent of a blanket. Beyond the windows, the sky remained pale but content. The occasional flutter of a bird or the gentle sway of a tree branch did little to disturb the serenity. The garden paths lay still. The fountains, if they flowed, did so silently. It was as if the palace itself was encouraging rest. Inside, the shadows lengthened. The warmth of the fire wrapped itself around the king's ankles, then his knees, then higher still. His breath slowed. The book slipped gently to the cushion beside him, undisturbed. One arm shifted slightly and came to rest across his lap, the other against the chair's velvet seam. His eyelids grew heavier, not suddenly, but steadily. A sensation not unlike floating began to unfold within him. The weight of the chair seemed to disappear beneath him, and all that remained was warmth, breath, and stillness. The fire crackled once more. A log shifted, collapsing slightly inward, releasing a gentle puff of smoke and a brief glow of embers. The scent deepened, rich and earthy. The sound, soft, irregular, was the only thing left to mark the hour. Even the ticking clock on the mantel had ceased its sway for a while. The room had become a cocoon of quiet, a hush cradled in stone and wood and firelight. The king's head tilted slightly to one side. His breathing, deep and even now, matched the rhythm of the flickering shadows. His thoughts, no longer tethered to tasks or titles, dissolved into the soft darkness behind his eyes. Time did not pass quickly here. It wandered, ambled, dozed in a nearby chair. The nap was not a pause in the day. It was the day, folded gently into itself. There was no sense of duration, no anticipation of what would follow. Only the slow unfolding of sleep like parchment. Unfurling in silence, the chair creaked softly beneath him, not a protest, but a sigh of contentment. The king's robes, loose and unbuttoned now, gathered around him like a blanket. His fingers twitched once, as if still tracing a line from the book he had nearly finished, then settled once more. Outside, a cloud moved on, letting a shaft of golden light pass across the window panes. The glow fell upon the king's resting face, gentle and kind. It lingered there for a while, illuminating the quiet lines of age and grace. In this moment, the world seemed to pause with him. No duties knocked at the door. No decisions waited in the next room. Everything that mattered had already happened. The nap, simple and complete, was the crown of the day. And in that warm little room beside the fire, the king slept. The warmth of the nap lingered as the king stirred gently from sleep. There was no abruptness, no jolt, only a slow return, like mist drifting from the edge of a meadow as sunlight finds its way through. His fingers moved first, brushing softly, along the velvet arm of the chair. Then his shoulders shifted, adjusting slightly under the comforting weight of his robe. His eyes remained closed for a moment longer, savoring the final notes of the slumber. The fire had dimmed, but was still, glowing. Embers nestled in their quiet pile, radiating a mellow heat that warmed the room's core. No new logs were needed. The moment had passed, and the next was ready to unfold. Slowly, peacefully, the king opened his eyes, the lids lifting as though drawn by silk cords. Light filtered in from the high windows in the sitting room. It had shifted since he'd last looked, and now it slanted lower, with a golden hue that signaled the coming of late afternoon. Dust motes drifted through the beams, catching the last energy of the sun like dancers in slow motion. He rose without haste, hands resting on the arms of the chair before standing. His legs felt steady, rested, and his breath remained soft and deep. There was no need to rush. This next hour was not about activity, but about presence. He stepped from the room and turned toward the music wing, a quiet stretch of the palace devoted not to spectacle, but to the subtle pleasures of sound. The corridor to the music room was lined with paneling of dark cherrywood, polished but soft. To the eye, light from small windows gave the walls a golden sheen, and the occasional framed sheet of old music hung in still reverence. The king's slippers made almost no sound on the woven rug beneath him as he walked. He passed a doorway left ajar, where a harp string had been recently plucked and still hummed in the silence. At the far end of the hallway, double doors stood open, welcoming him into a spacious chamber that smelled faintly of lemon oil and parchment. This was the music room, an airy, calming space where time often forgot itself. The ceiling rose in a graceful arch, painted with faded clouds and birds that looked as if they might float gently from the plaster and into the rafters. Along the perimeter, instruments rested patiently in their designated places. A small harpsichord, a cello lying in its cradle, a violin on a cushioned chair. In one corner, a harp stood beside a tall window, its strings catching the light in soft golden lines. But it was the center table that drew the eye first. A silver tea service had been placed with quiet care, no clattering, no fuss. The teapot gleamed in the afternoon light, flanked by small cups with saucers as thin as eggshells. A bowl of clotted cream, a dish of preserves, and a stack of neatly arranged scones awaited gentle hands. A linen napkin covered a tray of finger sandwiches, their crusts trimmed and their fillings just barely visible through the delicate bread. The king moved toward the chair closest to the harp, where the light was softest, a footman having prepared. Everything earlier was nowhere to be seen, only the faint echo of footsteps, long since gone. The chair was high-backed and upholstered in damask, its arms curved like the lines of a sonata. The king sat and reached for the tea with the familiarity of a man who knew this ritual well. He poured slowly, letting the dark stream of jasmine-scented tea swirl into the cup. A curl of steam rose and twisted, and he watched it dissipate before, lifting the cup to his lips. The flavor was delicate and comforting, the warmth immediate, but not too much. It soothed rather than stimulated. The softest hum of string music floated in from a neighboring room, perhaps someone practicing scales, or perhaps it was the echo of earlier melodies still lingering in the air. On the plate, he selected a single scone. It crumbled slightly as he spread it with cream and just a touch of blackberry jam. He took a bite and let it dissolve slowly on his tongue, the sweetness mingling with the floral notes of the tea. There was no need for more. The moment was already complete. The music. Room seemed to hold its breath in serene rhythm. The light across the floor stretched farther, brushing against a polished music stand where old sheet music lay open, though no one stood behind it. The pages rustled faintly as a breeze passed through the half-open window. Outside, the branches of a nearby tree stirred slightly, sending shadows moving gently across the floor like notes on a stave dot as he continued to sip. The king leaned back slightly in his chair. His gaze wandered across the ceiling, tracing the faded paintwork where cherubs floated lazily above the scene. The room was suspended in a kind of golden stillness, as though designed not to impress, but to soothe. Even the clock seemed quieter here, ticking only if one truly listened. The tea was half gone now. A small pastry remained on the plate, untouched. He did not need it. The presence of the food was enough its order, its readiness, its quiet. Invitation to slow down. A second cup was poured, the tea slightly cooler now, and all the more calming for it. He held it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. From the corner, the harp seemed to catch the light and reflect it back. Its strings had not been played today, but their quiet gleam held a presence all their own. They shimmered in the hush, a reminder that beauty does not always require sound. It can simply be still. The king closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, not quite, but to drift. The scent of jasmine, the hush of the room, the warmth of the tea all combined to create a softness that reached beyond comfort. It touched something deeper, something ancient and slow. The soul, perhaps, at rest. When he opened his eyes again, nothing had changed. The tea still steamed. The music. Room remained. The sun hovered just outside the window, lowering itself inch by inch toward evening. The sun, now gently reclining toward the horizon, cast longer rays into the quiet corridors of the palace. The king rose from his seat in the music room, his movements unhurried, as though he floated rather than walked. There was no need to speak, no need to announce a change in pace. Everything flowed as softly as the light around him. He moved slowly down a familiar hallway, one that led toward a smaller salon, just past the library, a space lined with aged books and musical relics, where sound and silence met in harmony. This room, tucked beside an interior courtyard, had windows that caught the final brushstrokes of daylight. Here, time often paused without anyone noticing Dot as he entered. The door whispered shut behind him. The room greeted him with stillness. No ticking clock disturbed the hush. Only the gentle hum of evening air passing through half-lifted windows could be heard, mingling with the faint rustle of ivy brushing the outside stone. A harp sat in one corner, older than the king himself, its curved frame golden in the light. Beside it, a music stand held a piece of parchment with a handwritten melody, its notes carefully inked long ago. No musician was present. And yet there was music. The king settled into a high-backed chair near the window. Its upholstery was faded but comfortably warm. The armrests bore the soft impressions of years spent in quiet contemplation. Before him sat a low table, stacked with books, their leather covers cracked and edges softly frayed, pages waiting with open arms. He reached for the first one. It was a slim volume, its title etched faintly in gold. The cover had once been deep green, now mellowed to the color of moss after rain. Inside, the pages exhaled that comforting scent known only to old books. A blend of parchment, time, and forgotten thoughts. He turned the first page. The sound it made was like the sigh of a curtain in the breeze, soft, deliberate, and full of memory. His eyes moved slowly across the lines, not to absorb information, but to linger with the shapes of the words, the flow of the letters, rhythm of the silence between sentences. A few notes from a distant instrument drifted through the air. Someone in another part of the palace, perhaps rehearsing gently for their own pleasure. It was not a melody meant to entertain, but to exist. The sounds entered the room like old friends arriving with nothing urgent to say. The king continued reading. A passage about gardens caught his eye, descriptions of vines curling along archways, of petals falling into stone basins, of bees humming lazily from one bloom to the next. The image called to mind his morning walk, the softness of herbs underfoot, and the hush that settled in the branches when he passed beneath. Another page turned. The shadows in the room shifted slightly, lengthening along the floor as if stretching before their nighttime rest. Dust motes floated through the slanting light, and the king watched them for a moment, his book resting gently in his lap. Outside the window, a dove cooed softly from the edge of a stone ledge. The sound was low and steady, like the breath of the palace itself, ancient, calm, and infinitely patient. He closed the book without haste and reached for another, this one bound in warm brown leather, its pages thicker, its edges uneven. Inside, he found an account of the star's old observations, sketched diagrams, gentle theories wrapped in wonder. There was a kind of poetry in it, a rhythm not of rhyme, but of curiosity. He ran a finger along one of the drawings, a constellation shaped like a lyre. How fitting, he thought, in a room where strings had so often sung into the quiet. The breeze shifted again, and with it came the faintest scent of lavender, perhaps from a nearby sachet tucked between books, or a drying bouquet left near the open sill. It was subtle, yet grounding, wrapping the room in a soft, floral haze. He looked up and around. The light had dimmed even more now, fading into the edges of twilight. Shadows crept slowly across the bookshelves, and the corners of the room began to blur, not from darkness, but from softness. The world was becoming quieter by degrees. He set the book down and leaned back. His eyes traced the pattern of the ceiling, where faint decorative plaster curled along the edges like gentle scrollwork. There were no grand frescoes here, just subtle curves and outlines, enough to invite thought, but never to distract. In the silence, he could almost hear the memory of past music, the echo of bowed strings, the low tones of a flute, the soft tinkle of keys pressed with care. Music in this room was never loud. It was always a companion to reflection, never a performance. The king rested his head slightly to one side, eyes half closed. His breathing had slowed without his noticing, drawn into the rhythm of the hour. Everything around him seemed designed not to demand attention, but to welcome release. A final note, distant and almost imperceptible, vibrated in the air and then faded. Whether real or remembered, it didn't matter. It was part of the room. Now, part of the breathless hush that wrapped around the king like a gentle shawl. He opened one last book, an anthology of poetry. The first page carried a verse about time as a winding river, flowing not toward an end, but toward stillness. He read the stanza twice, then let the book close on its own, its spine sighing quietly. Night approached, not with coldness, but with warmth. The window reflected the deepening blue of the sky, and the room, once full of gold, now settled into soft silver. Candles had not yet been lit. There was no need. In the embrace of this gentle room, where notes drifted and pages whispered, the king found no urgency, only calm. He would stay a little longer, resting not from fatigue, but because rest was welcome. The books, the light, the silence, they asked nothing more. Evening in the palace arrived not as a sudden change, but as a gentle shift, as if the air itself began to hum in a lower, softer note. It began at the windows, where the last of the sunlight hesitated before melting into golden streaks across. The floor. The quiet deepened, stretching into every hall and room like a sigh of contentment after a long, uneventful day. In the royal dining room, the transformation into night had already begun. Candles were lit one by one, not with haste, but with a ceremonial calm. Their soft flames danced in polished silver holders that stood like sentinels along the length of the long, dark table. The room glowed not brightly, but warmly, with an amber hush that seemed to coat every surface in stillness. The long drapes had been drawn halfway, allowing only the faintest outlines of the dusky sky to peer in. A breeze moved slowly through the open cracks in the windows, carrying the scents of the garden lavender, damp stone, and something faintly sweet that couldn't quite be named. At the center of the table rested a small arrangement of dried herbs and pale flowers. They were not lavish nor meant to impress. They simply existed, resting quietly as though they'd always belonged there. A sprig of rosemary leaned gently against a feathered bloom of chamomile, both nodding toward sleep, the servants who prepared. The table worked in practiced silence. Their movements were light, their presence barely a whisper. Linen was folded with care, porcelain plates placed with intention. Silverware gleamed under the flicker of candlelight, catching glints of fire like distant stars. The king entered without grandeur. His slippers padded softly across the stone floor, and his robe whispered faintly with each step. He did not announce his arrival, and none was needed. This was not a feast, not a royal banquet, but a personal ritual, a final meal at the edge of day, meant not to celebrate, but to soothe. He took his seat at the head of the table. The high-backed chair welcomed him like an old friend. The cushion underneath gave just slightly as he settled in, and his eyes rested on the stillness before him. The first dish arrived without sound. A shallow bowl of clear vegetable broth. Steam rose in soft spirals, slow and weightless, dissipating into a candlelit air. The king lifted the silver spoon gently and sipped. The warmth moved through him in a quiet wave, not dramatic, but complete. A subtle blend of carrots, leek, and thyme whispered against his senses. He took his time, placing the spoon down between each taste, as though stretching the moment out to meet the silence. The next course followed as naturally as breath, a small wedge of cheese, creamy and pale, beside a few slices of toasted bread. The crusts were golden and thick, the interior soft and giving. There was no need for more. The bread gave softly beneath his fingers, and the cheese melted in quiet warmth across his tongue. It was food made not for indulgence, but for reflection. Each chew was slow. The king's eyes often wandered toward the far end of the room, not to observe, but simply to let his thoughts drift there. The flickering shadows on the wall moved slowly, swaying with the rhythm of the flames. Outside, the garden had slipped into darkness, but its presence remained. The smell of earth after sunlight, the ghost of rosemary carried in the air, all folded into the room like a memory. One could almost hear the hush of leaves settling in for the night. The last course was something sweet. A small tart, the crust perfectly browned, the filling warm with cinnamon and baked apple. It rested on a porcelain plate painted with a faded blue rim, barely wide enough to hold the dessert. A silver dessert fork lay beside it, polished and quiet. The first bite filled his mouth with warmth and the memory of orchard trees in late summer, their branches bowed beneath the weight of fruit. Bees humming lazily in tall grass dot, the king let the flavor linger. He closed his eyes briefly, not in sleep, but in presence. There was no reason to hurry. Supper, in this quiet corner of the world, was not a task to complete. It was a pause, a moment to exhale at the end of the day's rhythm. The flames of the candles burned steadily now, the wax collecting in softened puddles at their bases. A few had begun to lean, the wick curling downward like a bowing head. The shadows they cast grew longer, draping over chairs and table legs like folds of velvet dot with the final spoonful finished. The king rested his hands lightly in his lap. His eyes wandered not fixed on anything, but adrift in the comfort of stillness. He breathed in slowly. The faint creak of wood in the rafters above offered a gentle rhythm, one that seemed to rock the entire room into an unspoken lullaby. Didn't rise immediately. There was no rush to leave this space, to move toward anything else. The room had become a chamber of memory and warmth. Even the silence seemed to have softened. Eventually, when the last of the tart's warmth had faded and the tea had gone cool in its cup, the king stood. He moved with ease, not because he was full of energy, but because his body knew these motions well, each step rehearsed in peace, each pause a gesture of contentment. The dining room, once full of motion, returned to its earlier hush. The chair, gently pushed back into place, the cutlery untouched now, the candles still flickering in their final watch, and as the king left the room, he did not look back. He didn't need to. The room would wait. The supper would return, just as it had, so many nights before. But tonight, it had done what it was meant to do. It had slowed the world, warmed the spirit, and folded the day gently closed. Night had fully arrived at the palace, not with noise or fanfare, but with an almost invisible grace. The air had cooled. The sky had darkened into layers of deep blue and velvet black, and the distant stars had begun their quiet shimmer, spreading themselves gently above the world dot inside. The palace had grown still. The footsteps of attendants no longer echoed down the stone corridors. The kitchens were quiet. The clocks ticked softly behind closed doors. Candles flickered more slowly now, their light dimming to an amber hush. It was the hour between thought and sleep, a time set aside for drifting, for wandering not with purpose, but with presence. King George, wrapped in a robe of soft wool, stepped out through the tall double doors of the rear vestibule and onto the garden path. The stones beneath his feet were cool and smooth, laid in careful rows generations before. They held the chill of night gently, like a calm hand to the skin. The air was sharp but kind, filled with scents that only emerged in darkness moss. Cool earth, the fading perfume of jasmine still lingering in the hedges. Overhead, the sky held no moon tonight, only stars, thousands of them, stretching wide across the heavens like pinpricks in a curtain of ink. He moved slowly, not just out of age or habit, but because this walk was never meant to be hurried. Each step was part of a quiet ceremony he had repeated most nights of his life. It wasn't about distance or health. It was about peace. The gravel crunched softly beneath his slippers. The breeze stirred the tall hedgerows to his left, and their leaves whispered like ancient voices, sharing nothing urgent, only the endless musings of the wind. A gentle rustling, a sway of branches, the hush of petals brushing against one another. All the garden had gone to sleep except for the path and the stars. He paused at a small stone bench along the curve of the walkway. The bench had no cushion, but it didn't need one. It had always been a place of rest, more than comfort, a seat to sit still, to look upward. He lowered himself slowly and let his gaze drift to the heavens. The stars blinked back, steady and untroubled. Their distance made them harmless, their light delayed by years, their presence patient. They did not demand attention. They simply were dot around him. The palace grounds extended into softness. Rows of neatly trimmed bush stood like sleeping sentinels. The flower beds had curled in for the night. Even the small fountain in the distance had been turned off, its basin holding still water that reflected the stars as perfectly as the sky itself. The king took a deep breath. The coolness filled his chest, but didn't startle him. It grounded him. Inhale. Exhale. No thoughts of court or country, of matters or ministers, just the quiet ceremony of breath beneath an open sky not far off in the distance, the faintest sound of hooves echoed across the still fields beyond the palace. A carriage returning late, perhaps, or a guard making rounds. The sound wasn't intrusive. It was a lullaby in motion, a rhythmic reminder that even beyond these hedgerows, the world was still spinning gently, peacefully, and without hurry. He rose again, continuing his walk. The gravel path led him around the edge of the south garden, past a line of boxwoods clipped into gentle shapes. There were no lights, save for the sky, but the king knew each curve and corner. He could walk this route with his eyes closed. He had, once or twice, in younger days, and the memory made him smile without showing it. In the garden center stood an old sundial, now of course useless in the dark, but not without meaning. He paused beside it, letting his fingers trace the cold brass edges of the gnomon, feeling the smooth surface chilled by night. It had once told time, now it held stillness. Both had their place. Somewhere above, a night bird gave a low, distant call. Not a cry, not a warning, just a sound, as natural and unobtrusive as the rustle of silk. The king stood still, allowing it to come and pass. He did not respond to it, nor chase it. It was part of the world, and the world did not need fixing tonight. A few steps farther, he came to the edge of a small orchard, tucked just behind the west wall. The trees here were old, their branches sprawling like quiet stories in every direction. Their leaves no longer rustled. They only shimmered slightly, catching the faint wind like fabric on a forgotten line. He walked between the trees, letting his fingers brush the bark of one. It was smooth in places, rough in others, and it held the warmth of countless seasons. Beneath one tree, there was a bench lower, made of wood, not stone. It creaked as he sat down, but not with complaint. It simply made room for him. From here, he could see the upper towers of the palace framed against the sky. Tiny candle glows still flickered in a few windows. The rest were dark. Rooms at rest, as they should be. He did not stay long. The cool of the night had settled over his shoulders, and the warmth waiting inside called to him, not loudly, but like a soft hand on the shoulder. It was time to return. And so he rose again, walked the path in reverse, retracing the steps that had brought him here, not because he had to, but because returning was as much a part of the ritual as the wandering. The palace came slowly back into view. Its walls were still and strong, touched by the faintest reflections of starlight. The windows remained quiet. The doors, gently lit from within, stood ready to welcome him back. And as he stepped through them once more, the world outside remained. The garden slept. The stars burned on. And the night, in all its silence, continued to breathe. The palace had grown utterly quiet now. The corridors, once filled with the soft motion of polished shoes and velvet hems brushing against stone, stood in complete stillness. The hush of night had deepened. It wasn't simply an absence of sound, it was a fullness, a warmth that wrapped gently around each corner and stairwell, like a blanket drawn carefully over old stone. Inside the royal bedchamber, the preparations for rest were underway not hurriedly, nor with ceremony, but with the same quiet rhythm that had carried the king through every hour of the day. The door eased shut behind him with a barely audible click. The walls, dressed in faded tapestries and soft silks, welcomed him back, their muted tones glowing dimly in the candlelight. The room was not grand in its design, though it was certainly elegant. It was comfortable in a way that felt unchanging, like the ticking of a familiar clock, or the slow breathing of the sea. The air smelled of beeswax polish, dried lavender, and the faintest trace of linen warmed by fire. Slippers were waiting beside the hearth, their leather worn soft by years of use. The king sat on the edge of a small bench and exchanged them for the polished shoes he had worn throughout the day. The slippers were light, and they gave under the weight of his feet as though remembering him from before. Their silence upon the floor was a welcome part of the room's gentle music. Beside the bench, a low table held a folded dressing gown of wool, brushed soft and dyed the color of old moss. It was lined with velvet, and the sleeves were wide and loose. The king slipped it over his shoulders, the fabric settling into place with the ease of habit. Its weight was reassuring, neither heavy nor light, just enough to remind him he was home. Candles flickered low on the mantel, their flames swaying with the quiet air. A log in the hearth gave a soft crackle, then settled into glowing embers. The fire no longer roared, but it didn't need to. Its warmth was steady, humming gently through the stone and into the floor. At the center of the room stood the bed. Tall, with carved posts and heavy curtains pulled back, it looked like a ship waiting to sail through sleep. The sheets were turned down neatly. A hot water bottle wrapped in cloth lay tucked at the foot. The pillows, fluffed and indented slightly in the center, held the promise of deep rest. On a nearby table, a silver tray sat prepared. A folded handkerchief, a small linen cloth, a brush with dark bristles. Everything had its place, and nothing was out of order. There were no sharp edges here, no cold surfaces or harsh light. Only softness and the sense that this room had been designed to lull, not impress. In the corner, a wardrobe stood half open. From its door hung the king's nightshirt, pressed and folded across a wooden hanger. It swayed slightly, responding to a draft that no one could hear. The cotton was pale and fine, stitched along the collar with a single thread of silver. He changed slowly, letting the coolness of the fabric meet his skin. The sleeves draped past his wrists, the hem falling to his knees. It was not a garment of power or status, only one of rest. He sat again for a moment on the edge of the bed. The mattress beneath him gave with a gentle sigh. The sound was subtle, like memory itself stretching out under the weight of sleep. He breathed in slowly. The air was calm. The night beyond the windows was deep and still. A small rug of lamb's wool rested at his feet. It had been there for years, perhaps longer than he could remember. Its texture was plush and uneven, worn in the exact spot where his heels had pressed it each night. He curled his toes against it, grounding himself for just a moment longer before lying down. The bed received him with familiarity. The linen was crisp but not cold. The down within the blankets shifted gently, settling around his body like water finds its level. He pulled the sheets to his chest and allowed his head to sink into the pillow. The weight of the day lifted slowly, not because of fatigue, but because there was simply nothing left to carry. The curtains along the bed were left open. No need for separation or secrecy now. The darkness in the room was kind, not complete. A glow from the hearth gave shape to the furniture and painted long shadows against the far wall. The light moved slowly, a flicker here, a stretch there, never harsh, only soft. The king looked once more toward the ceiling. Above him, the beams, of dark wood, crossed like old arms folded in thought. Dust motes drifted through the air, catching the candlelight like tiny lanterns floating through a deep and gentle sea. From a hallway far off, the muffled chime of a grandfather clock counted the hour. The sound was slow, low, and distant-like, the heartbeat of the palace itself. 12 soft chimes, each spaced far enough apart that time seemed to stretch between them. He did not count them. He only let them happen, one after the other, until silence returned. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, a single note, not loud, not startling, just a reminder that the world beyond his windows was still alive and peaceful. The wind moved past the panes of glass in a slow caress, nudging the curtains gently, but not enough to disturb Dot in this quiet space. The king closed his eyes. Not sharply, not suddenly. They lowered like shutters being drawn over a window that faced the moon. Behind them, the thoughts of the day dissolved, not urgently, but gradually, like ink spreading in warm water. Each breath became longer now, each exhale softer. The body did not resist rest. It welcomed it. The day had been full, though nothing had demanded attention. And now nothing was needed. Only stillness. Only sleep. Dot. And so the king lay still. The fire whispered beside him. The slippers rested. Beside the bed, and time, ever loyal, continued its slow march through the folds of night. Within the stillness of the royal bedchamber, time had softened into something barely felt. The walls, tall and layered in tapestries of pale blue and woven gold, no longer held on to the echo of voices or footsteps. They had absorbed the day, and, with silent dignity, prepared themselves for night. The fireplace crackled gently in the far corner, casting a low amber glow across the stone hearth. The flames no longer danced, but flickered with long, slow movements, like thoughts that rose and fell without urgency. Each pulse of light from the fire created a quiet show of shadows, stretching long and soft across the walls, shifting slightly whenever a log gave way with a small sigh of embers. Dot above the bed. The ceiling beams loomed dark and sturdy, crafted from old oak long before the current generation of hands had touched them. Their presence was not heavy, only grounding. The occasional glint of firelight traced their grain, catching ridges and knots like a painter's careful brush. In the space between ceiling and floor, the hush of the room was complete. Heavy drapes lined the windows, their fabric drawn but not tightly shut. Through a slim space between the curtains, a line of moonlight filtered in, silver and soft, creating a narrow path of illumination that stretched across the rug and onto the base of the bedframe. It was the only outside light allowed to enter a single silent guest. The moonlight and firelight together filled the room with a patchwork of shadows. They moved as if breathing, but never sharply. The curtains swayed slightly at their base, moved by the quietest draft sneaking in from the windowsill. The gentle sway seemed to carry rhythm, like the slow rocking of a boat on still waters. A large wardrobe rested across from the bed, its dark wood panels closed tight, holding within it a stillness of its own. Its carved doors caught the shifting shadows which danced in and out of its details, the curves of vines, leaves, and heraldic symbols that told stories no one now remembered. There was no need to open it tonight. Everything needed had already been laid out, already worn, already removed. The wardrobe now served only as witness. On the bedside table, a single candle still burned. Its flame tilted gently as it responded to the faintest movement of air, but it did not flicker enough to threaten extinction. The candle's base was a simple bronze, darkened with age, and shaped into a trio of tiny feet that held it steady against the wooden surface. The wax had melted slowly over the evening, creating soft ridges down its length, little rivers of light frozen in place. Its flame painted the room with a warmth that wasn't heat, Instead, it offered tone. Everything touched by its light turned, slightly golden. The linens on the bed, the silken folds of the drapes, the edge of the old armchair in the corner, all glowed with quiet affection. There was no harshness here, no sharp reflection, only a gradual fading into darkness dot against the far wall. A long chest sat beneath the window. Upon it were carefully folded blankets, a book bound in leather, and a closed box that smelled faintly of cedar and rosewood. The chest was more than furniture. It had been part of the king's bedroom for decades, and its surface bore the marks of time scratches smoothed by hands, corners worn by seasons, and hinges that creaked faintly when disturbed, though none disturbed them now. Every detail in the room seemed to suggest patience. Nothing asked to be noticed. Nothing pressed forward. Everything waited, still and steady, as if the room itself had learned the rhythm of sleep. From the other side of the bedroom, a tall grandfather clock stood quietly in its alcove. Its face was pale, its hands slow, and its voice nearly silent. It did not tick loudly. Instead, it whispered the passage of seconds, its pendulum swaying with the grace of an old waltz. Each swing from side to side sounded like a breath-gentle, repeated, constant. And above it all, the chime was held back, reserved for the hour, not for the moment. The bed, broad and low, cradled the king in near-perfect stillness. His breath moved steadily beneath the layers of linen and wool, slow and even. His figure was outlined faintly in the shifting shadows, but he did not stir. Sleep had begun to wrap around him like another blanket one, made not of fabric, but of quiet. Each rise and fall of his chest seemed to echo the rhythm of the room dot at the foot. Of the bed, the edge of the coverlet rested in gentle folds over the bedframe. A small crease in the blanket slowly settled, as if even the fabric had exhaled. There were no sudden movements, no restless tosses. Even the air, touched by warmth and scented faintly with lavender and burning wood, seemed to glide rather than drift. Outside the thick windows, the stars turned slowly above the palace. Their light, while distant, slipped in wherever it could through cracks, under curtains, into dreams. Their patience was eternal, their company silent. A faint breeze stirred again, and the curtain on the right window lifted slightly at its edge. The movement allowed a new streak of moonlight to enter, this time landing across the floor in front of the fireplace. The flame, now low and curling around itself, responded by flickering a little brighter, as if acknowledging the moon's gentle visit, but no one moved to see it. The room required no more stories tonight, no more rituals. The day had long since passed, and the work of rest had begun. In the corners of the room, the shadows continued their slow ballet. They curved around furniture legs, floated across the ceiling beams, and whispered across the tapestry-covered walls. They did not threaten. They only softened, and as the fire eased lower, the candle burned down to its final inch, and the room grew dimmer still. The entire space seemed to breathe in sync with the sleeping king, slower, quieter, deeper. The palace, beyond the chamber, had long since gone still. But here, in this one room lit by memory and flame, night had found its place, and it would remain until morning whispered its return. In the dim quiet of the royal bedchamber, the air held steady, wrapped in layers of candlelight, fading warmth, and the hush of stillness. The room had surrendered to the rhythm of evening, where shadows stretched long and edges dulled into softness. This was the time when everything slowed, even the flicker of flame and the whisper of fabric. And before sleep arrived, there was one final moment the king honored without fail: the evening glass of warmed milk. Over the hearth, a low fire glowed patiently. Its flames had quieted into a bed of embers that pulsed orange and gold, casting a subtle light across the stonework and rug. Suspended above it, A small cast-iron kettle hung by a chain, cradling milk that had been warming for the better part of an hour. The liquid inside hadn't boiled, nor bubbled. It had simply absorbed heat, slowly and evenly, like parchment catching the sun near a window. A touch of cinnamon and a whisper of vanilla had been stirred in gently, their scents now drifting, like a memory through the chamber. Beside the bed, a tray had been placed on a low wooden table. The tray, made of silver polished over many years, caught the candlelight in a muted glimmer, not flashy, but mellow, like a quiet pond catching only the edge of moonlight. The cloth beneath was stitched with ivy green thread, its edges slightly frayed from years of use. Resting on it, a small silver cup stood ready, its sides rounded, designed to retain both warmth and quiet. The milk was poured with care. The act was performed so gently that no splash marked the air, just the faintest trickle, like the pouring of thought onto stillness. The steam that rose curled upward in delicate ribbons, each thread disappearing before it reached the height of the candle's flame. The scent deepened now, a rich warmth that didn't stir the appetite, but the heart familiar, comforting, like a childhood lullaby remembered by scent alone. At the edge of the chamber, thick velvet curtains hung heavy over the tall windows. Though drawn shut, they gently billowed at the base where the night air pressed softly against the glass. Outside, the world lay in slumber. The stone behind the fabric held a gentle chill, speaking of the calm darkness beyond, the kind that made indoor warmth feel like a soft fortress. The king, wrapped in a robe lined with aged cotton and trimmed with velvet, sat comfortably in his armchair. The chair, worn to a perfect softness over years, stood just beside the hearth where the heat gently kissed his legs. His slippers were already set aside, and his feet rested on a wool rug that cushioned each breath of movement. On his lap, his hands curled gently around the cup, lifting it toward his mouth in an unhurried motion. The first sip was always quiet. Not a sound, not even the faintest clink of silver on teeth, just a slow acceptance of the warmth, a letting in of peace. The milk had just enough heat to soothe, but not surprise. The vanilla and cinnamon had mellowed into it perfectly, becoming part of the warmth rather than resting atop it. After each sip, the king paused. His eyes closed a little, not from tiredness, but from contentment. Around him, everything was tuned to silence. The hearth cracked only now and then, a log shifting slightly as it surrendered its heat. In the corner of the room, the grandfather clock continued its slow, reverent ticking, its pendulum swaying in its own ritual, never demanding attention. Its sound blended into the stillness, a lullaby without words. The scent of the warmed milk lingered in the air, braided with the old perfume of lavender that had been used to press the linens and line the king's robe. Lavender that had been dried and wrapped in linen sachets months ago, now quietly perfuming the fabric like time, itself leaving a trace. The king's breath matched the rhythm of the room. Inhale with the fire's flicker, exhale with the drift of steam. After the final sip, he set the cup gently back onto the tray. The cup left a ring of warmth on the cloth, barely visible in the candlelight, already fading into quiet. It was a small, ordinary act, but here it held meaning, the closure of the day's last gesture, a note of finality written in silver and steam. He stood slowly, not because of stiffness, but because this moment required no rush. His robe shifted as he moved, whispering softly against the woven threads of the chair's upholstery. His steps toward the bed were measured, slippered feet making no sound. Upon the rug, the bed awaited him, its sheets already turned down, the corners folded just so, as they had been every evening for years. He sat first on the edge, resting a hand upon the mattress as if to greet it. The candle beside the bed flickered, sensing his presence, casting a last round of shadows across the carved bedpost and soft linen. The warmth from the milk had spread gently through him now, not just in body, but in mind, settling his thoughts like snowflakes, finding rest on quiet ground. He leaned back against the pillows, the robe falling gently to his sides. The covers were pulled up slowly, with hands used to care and repetition. The scent of vanilla still clung to the air, mingled now with the faint fragrance of old wood and warm linen. Outside, the stars continued their slow arc across the sky. The garden below lay in velvet quiet. Not a leaf stirred, not a single breeze slipped past. Only stillness, only peace. Inside, the shadows on the wall settled into their shapes, as though the room itself had begun to rest. The candle burned low now, its base glowing more than the flame itself. Light faded across the stone and rug, pooling into darkness that welcomed, not concealed. Nothing remained undone. No sound remained to be made. Just the final breath before sleep, the glass of warm milk had done its quiet work. And the king, now completely at ease, let his thoughts drift with the scent of cinnamon and lavender. His body eased into the bed's embrace, his breath deepened, and the night wrapped gently around him like a story closing its final page. The king now lay almost entirely still, wrapped beneath the soft folds of linen and wool, his body gradually surrendering to the full embrace of sleep. Yet in that gentle space between waking and dreaming, when the fire's glow flickers low and thoughts drift in hazy loops, the mind often finds itself meandering through quiet memories, soft echoes of the day, small details from the past, fragments too gentle to disturb, yet too sweet to dismiss. He did not move, nor speak, nor open his eyes. But within him, a procession of serene impressions began to drift across the surface of consciousness, as if borne on a breeze just light enough to stir the curtains. These were not plans, nor worries, nor regrets. They were the remnants of sunlight on stone, of steam curling from tea, of the scent of beeswax and rose petals on polished wood. His thoughts wandered, as a stroll would, back through the rooms he had passed that day. He recalled the morning light breaking through the eastern window, how it had cast a golden shaft across the floor of his breakfast chamber. He had watched the dust particles sparkle in that light as he sipped his tea, so slow, so silent, so forgotten by time. He remembered the garden next, the way the rosemary and mint had brushed gently against the edges of the gravel path. There, oils releasing into the air with every step. The dappled shade beneath the arbor had reminded him of summer days from long ago, when the vines were still young and the bench beneath them had been freshly painted. The memory did not anchor him. It carried him, softly, deeper into quiet. He thought of the library, where he had read only a single page before setting the book aside. He had not needed more. The feel of the leather binding, the faint scent of old parchment, and the creak of the wooden chair beneath him had offered more than words ever could. He had sat in silence there for a long while, with the afternoon light stretching lazily across the rug, just watching the flame of a nearby candle shift slightly in rhythm with his breath. Then there had been supper, not for the food itself, but for the hush of the room, the gentle gleam of polished forks, the careful folds of cloth napkins, the stillness of porcelain bowls resting on their saucers. He had eaten slowly, more for the sensation than for the taste, pausing often to let time pass between each bite, never in a rush, never interrupted. Now, under his blankets, the final warmth from the fire still reached him barely, like the yoli, like the last flicker of a dream. The candle by his bedside had nearly burned down, its glow dimming to a quiet hush, throwing long shadows against the drapes. His thoughts turned once more to the garden, but this time it was night. He pictured the dark hedges outlined in starlight, the soft path lit only by the reflection of the moon across the polished stone. He imagined the roses asleep in their beds, their petals folding inward, breathing slowly in the cool air. The air would be crisp, but not biting. The breeze gentle, like a lullaby for leaves. His memory floated to the music room, where the harp had rested untouched, its strings catching slivers of candlelight. No melodies had been played that day, and yet the silence of the instrument was its own kind of song, a gentle pause that hummed quietly beneath the stillness. The king's breath remained steady. His body did not stir, but his mind continued to drift gently over these soft edges of recollection. He thought of the warmed milk, of the silver tray, of the quiet ring it had left behind on the cloth. He remembered how the vanilla had risen in the steam, how the cinnamon had curled just beneath the surface. It had reminded him of childhood, of colder seasons, of quiet kitchens lit only by a stove's soft glow. Another thought moved through him like mist, the old oak chest beneath the window, lined with folded blankets, one of which he remembered being stitched by hand long ago, its faded threads forming the shape of small ivy leaves. The memory of those leaves, imperfect and beloved, rested in his thoughts like a sigh. The sound of the clock's pendulum faded from his mind, though it continued, unseen and unfelt, in the room beyond. The tick no longer reached him. Only silence remained, thick, full, kind. The king's fingers curled gently above the edge of the blanket, loosened slightly as sleep edged closer. His jaw slackened, his breath deepened, and yet still within, soft thoughts continued their gentle turning, like pages in a book read long ago and cherished not for the story, but for the way it made him feel. There were no decisions, no duties, no calls to attend to. The palace, too, had exhaled. The halls no longer echoed. The servants, long retired to their quarters, had allowed the silence to return. It was the hour in which even the walls seemed to rest. He thought once more of slippers by the bed, of the way his robe had folded over the arm of the chair, of the way moonlight had cut through the curtain's edge like a silver ribbon. These were the things he carried into sleep, not burdensome, only soft, only familiar. And as the candlelight faded to a final glow, and the last of his waking thoughts dissolved into stillness, the night outside deepened. The wind whispered softly against the stone. The stars continued their slow, deliberate drift. Inside, the king slept, and the room, faithful and still, kept watch. Night settled over the palace with a breath of calm that seemed to pause time itself. Each stone of the old estate absorbed the coolness of the evening, while the air within glowed faintly with the last warmth of the day. In the king's chamber, the fire had dwindled into a bed of red embers. Shadows played on the ceiling like the soft hands of sleep brushing across the silk. The sounds of the palace had long faded into near silence. The gentle patter of servants had ceased hours ago. Now there remained only the occasional sigh of shifting wood, or the distant murmur of wind curling past high windows. The whole world had gone still, resting in shared silence with its sovereign. The king lay deep within his velvet-curtained bed, the fabric thick enough to muffle sound, but thin enough for the faintest moonlight to spill through. Each breath he took was long and slow, his chest rising with an almost imperceptible rhythm. The linens tucked around him were warm and fragrant, lavender-scented, from the day's airing in the garden sun. Elsewhere in the castle, no candle remained bright. Most had been pinched or allowed to burn down to a flicker, leaving only the mellow orange glimmer of coals. The corridors glowed faintly, painted in shadows that stretched and yawned like old cats curling into rest. Paintings faded into darkness. Tapestries hung without motion, their threads resting from centuries of color and wind. Outside, the garden slept. Paths once traveled by slow, thoughtful steps were now coated in dew. Leaves no longer rustled, but simply rested. Fountains gave no song. Even the stars, scattered generously across the heavens, blinked lazily, content to shine without performance or expectation. The kitchens had long gone quiet. The great ovens, once glowing with soft golden heat, were now darkened, their doors ajar to let the coolness in. Silver spoons lay still beside porcelain dishes, each piece washed, dried, and set aside for morning. All smells of baking and brewing had faded, leaving only a distant trace of spice that hung in the wood beams dot in the music room. An untouched harp stood by the window, its strings still, but not abandoned, just resting. Sheet music lay open, where it had been left earlier that day, the notes gently illuminated by the glow of the stars. The whole room, wrapped in velvet silence, waited not for performance, but for nothing at all. The king's slippers had been placed neatly under the bed, their soft leather worn smooth from years of gentle use. On the small table beside him, a silver clock ticked softly, marking each second with a tender, almost apologetic sound. There were no more schedules to follow, no more meals to plan. The time was now owned by stillness. Curtains swayed slightly with the breeze that wandered. In through a cracked window, it brought with it the scent of mint and damp earth. Somewhere, a night bird cooed, not urgently, just once. A note shared with the night and then gone. The palace accepted the sound and absorbed it like breath. A single oil lamp remained lit. In a hallway far down the eastern wing, its flame moved slowly, almost like it knew this was the hour for peace. Beneath it, stone tiles glowed a soft honey hue. Nothing disturbed them. Even the drafts had taken rest. Servants had all retired to their own chambers. Blankets were pulled over shoulders, and sleepy limbs had folded into themselves like leaves closing under moonlight. Outside those chambers, the night wrapped the building in its shawl of hush and coolness. The whole building, once so orderly, so orchestrated, had become like a sleeping child, still but full of soft dreams. It no longer mattered what time the milk had been warmed, or which page of the journal had been marked. The day's details had faded like fog at sunrise. Even memory seemed to sleep now. The sounds of pages turning, the scent of roasted root vegetables, the brief flicker of gold on china, all of it remained, but like impressions in pillows, no longer sharply felt, only softly known. Now, dear, listen, it is time for you too to rest. There is nothing left to do. The halls are quiet. The light is low. The day, once so gently layered with rituals and soft moments, has come to its close dot in the room of the king. All is calm. The candle by the bedside flickers lower and lower. The last warmth of the coals is now only a hum. The room holds a soft, embracing silence, the kind that you don't need to fill, only feel. Take a long, slow breath. Feel the air around you settle, just like the palace has. Let your arms rest, your feet grow warm, your thoughts grow quieter and dimmer, like lights. Fading behind closed doors. Imagine the softness of that royal bed, the scent of lavender, the weight of heavy drapes, the hush of velvet in the air. The world has exhaled, and you too are free to let go now. The stars will remain where they are. The winds will whisper without need. And you, like the king, can close your eyes without worry, without question, and simply be. Sleep does not ask for effort, only softness. Let this quiet wrap around you. Let the rhythms of the palace, the gentle creaks, the ticking clock, the rustle of curtains, be your lullaby. Let the stillness become a blanket. There is nothing else to remember. There is nowhere else to be. Where the day ends in quiet warmth, may your night begin in peace. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well, and we'll see you again next time.